Hi everyone, this is round two of me talking to Chris Mandel about risk management competencies, what makes a successful risk leader, and we'll talk about risk strategy as well. Thank you for joining. Do introduce yourself to us as well. Write in the chat what's your name, where you're watching from, and as more people will join us, um, hopefully they'll contribute as well. Now keep an open mind for this. Make sure you ask a lot of questions. Be proactive, write in comments, challenge some of the things we're discussing, and hope you enjoy the following 45 minutes to an hour. So Chris, welcome. Can you tell our viewers just a little bit about yourself, and then I'll jump into some of the questions I have for you.
Yeah. Good morning, Alex. It's 9 a.m. here in Nashville, Central Time, U.S. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you're dialed in from. My current role is a Senior Vice President of Strategic Solutions for Sedgwick, and I lead the Sedgwick Institute, which is kind of a thought-leading, problem-solving institution we stood up a couple of years ago. My background is about 25 years in large global corporate risk, where I was leading risk management efforts for companies like PepsiCo, Verizon, USAA, a diversified financial services company, and the American Red Cross. Spent a little time with a broker, Marsh. Started with an insurer, Liberty. Have a master's in business finance. And have been president of the Risk Management Society, and have a still continuing keen interest in risk management practiced on a progressive, broader level. Call it ERM, call it integrated, call it whatever you want. I like to call it risk management, what it should have always been. And
Yep.
And as Alex and I have talked many times, the way it's being practiced is a wide spectrum of really bad stuff to some good stuff, and then everything in between. Right, Alex?
Yes, and just like many things in the world, for some reason it's slightly skewed towards the bad stuff. There are more questionable practices in risk than there are good stuff. But what I wanted to talk to you about today now, Chris has on the Sedgwick Institute website has a series of podcasts which I think are very amazing, because Chris has this great opportunity to speak to very senior leaders in risk, and I've just provided a link to that page in the comment section. So do make sure you check out the podcast and subscribe to it if there is a functionality to subscribe to it. So Chris, you have spoken with a lot of different senior risk people. What are some of the qualities? What are some of the competencies do you think that they share between them? What do they have in common? What makes a good risk leader?
Yeah, it's a good question, and of course the answer is all over the board. Even so, because as you know, Alex, one of my kind of core principles is that on the one hand, risk leaders need to do what they were hired to do first, and however that's defined. And so often that's a focus on, as I say, preventing or reducing the impact of the bad things. Too much of the time, of course, it relates to insurable risk. That's more of a North American a legacy, where the discipline just came out of the insurance world. I mean, to be clear, risk management in America was insurance buying 50, 60 years ago. And it kind of morphed into the three-legged stool of prevention, financing, and control, but it was still insurance focused. So in order to do those jobs well, you didn't need more than a typical set of good fundamental management 101 traits. And in the North American world, management 101 didn't necessarily include any particular expertise in understanding risk and how risk related to performance or success. Another key kind of connection point from my particular way of thinking. So you could get away with a skill set, if that's your role, of just being pretty good at understanding how the insurance mechanism works in the world, not just North America, but it's a global mechanism, and how, you know, the risks that lend themselves to insurance, which we would admit are the more predictable risks, which, if I can transgress a little bit, are really, you know, maybe not even risks, right? I love to raise this controversial question of, if it's insurable, is it a risk, right? Because what insurers love actuarially more than anything else is predictability. They want to understand what is the expected level of loss. They want to understand that around, you know, the actuarial concept of confidence levels. All good if you're in the insurance game, but I think it raises this very significant question about, are expected losses really risks? Because they have basically a 50-50 level of certainty or uncertainty, however you look at it. So anyway, not to digress, we can go back to that later, but to answer your question, I think when, you know, enterprise risk, integrated risk, or this broader, more progressive perspective about risk began to emerge in the late 90s, you know, because of what, for example, was coming out of Australia, New Zealand, that became ISO 31000. You know, people were finally stepping up to take accountability for all risk, but more and more people. And so that really changed the answer to this question, right? Whether you were a chief risk officer or just a vice president or whatever you were, if in fact you had responsibility for all risks, then your skill set requirements were significantly different, right? So it was no longer about understanding the insurance mechanism and having a basic ability to pull off management responsibilities.
That's the idea, at least.
It was more about all kinds of things that risk managers had never even thought about before. Lots of things in the strategic realm where reputation and brand and competitive risk and M&A risk, well, you know, among many others, emerged as accountabilities and responsibilities that left a lot of people behind, quite frankly, because they weren't up to it. Going back to your question, they didn't have the skills to really understand all the risks of significance to the organization, let alone how to mitigate or deal with them. I'll stop there, and maybe, you know, you can interject another question. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking.
Yes, I mean, and examples of integrating into budgeting or investment decision or strategic decisions suddenly reminded us that you need a basic understanding of probability theory and decision theory, and those are actual, like, big scientific fields. It's not a matter of reading a book and becoming an expert. It's, you know, it's a field of study of at least 3 or 4 years. It's a completely different ballgame. So how do you think, based on your experience talking to senior people, did that work well? Have they adjusted? What do you tell us? What are you doing with the study group that you have on the master's program? How is North America kind of bridging that gap between being insurance based to now moving into this risk space and realizing that there is potentially a huge skill gap?
Well, the kind of iterations of it that evolved over the last nearly 20 years now took lots of different trajectories. One of the most common of which, I think, was to say, okay, if your job is really more traditional, I'll call it insurance based, but you're beginning to think about other things that should matter to you beyond safety or that prevention piece, which again is a part of that original troika, three-legged stool of prevention, finance, and control. Then you're asking questions about, well, what's my role in business continuity planning and crisis management? And as people began to think about other areas of responsibility, lots of mid-sized company and smaller risk managers who had broader accountabilities would pick up other functions. They may pick up the benefits function or some other ancillary function that wouldn't necessarily have direct relationship to risk, but because of the insurance element, people saw intersections there. So the job became a bit jumbled up with all kinds of other responsibilities, just as a matter of convenience. Because one of the things that is traditional if you will, in North America is, and it remains so today, a lot of senior execs and boards don't know where to put the function. And it ends up reporting about half the time to a finance function, and it ends up reporting to everyone you can imagine beyond that, from the legal department to the operational head to the human resources department and otherwise, often a matter just of convenience. And most of the time not for good, because they're not really thinking through it. They're just putting it where it's convenient. So, that happened for a while. It still happens to some degree. And then I would say that as people really want to understand, number one, did they need a chief risk officer? And what was a chief risk officer as differentiated from a risk manager? Which, we can talk about that question as at the point we get to this graphic that you've got up on the screen that we have here. But the evolution came out of the financial services world, particularly where money center banks and other big financial institutions were more likely to appoint somebody with that title, because typically I would say because they recognized the significance of, in a bank, for example, market and credit risk as the fundamental things that either make or break you, frankly, in a bank. So that's why, in my view, lots of those chief risk officers were really financial risk managers. Not a bad thing, because again, my philosophy is these guys need to do what they're hired to do. And if market and credit risk is the beginning and end of your success or failure, then you need somebody who really understands that stuff and can do it well. But a lot of those guys that took on the title of CRO in those institutions weren't really doing what you and I might call risk management or enterprise risk management, taking accountability for strategic risk, operational risk, and financial risk, the three big categories. They were focused on the things that they were told mattered most. And then, I would say in the last, 8 to 10 years, those roles have been more properly defined, where management said, well, if you're going to be our senior person responsible for risk or risk management process, then you really do need to have an understanding of everything we do, significance. And those people usually, ideally, come from, operational backgrounds, because at least in my view, those are the people that have the best understanding of all of what's going on, good and bad. And so the version of CROs that are being minted now are people that fit the bill more, that understanding, having the skill set to not just qualitatively understand risk, but as you so significantly believe, and I do too, to quantitatively understand and assess risk for the betterment of decision making. And so I think it's beginning to come to fruition, where the right definition of the job has emerged and the skill set underlying it is there as well. And so to your question about the Chief Risk Officer Executive Development Program that I advised and helped contribute to at George Mason University in Virginia, the class of which I just completed last night, spent a lot of time with a couple of dozen advisory council members who get it and who advise them in defining what a chief risk officer really should be. And then all those skills, including the understanding, as you point out, of probability theory and quantification of risk, but even more importantly, influencing and leadership skills that allow them to get a seat at the table with the right people to be able to influence significant decision making is at the heart of what the best of them do these days, and the skills that they do carry. And if they're not, that great at it, are working on improving.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now let me try and kind of make this both interactive and I'm trying to make this useful for everyone who has registered but haven't attended. What we'll do is we'll try and turn this conversation after the webinar into some sort of action plan for the risk managers to look at, and I'll record that. So the following discussion, let's structure it in terms of, here are 10 things that the CRO or a risk manager can do to become a better leader in the company. And the first one, I think, is kind of is obvious. Is realize your own limitations. I mean, that sounds so so cheesy, but it's actually it's more difficult than it sounds, because for many senior risk leaders, especially senior risk leaders, it's actually very mentally difficult. Mentally, it's not an easy thing to do, to realize that the world has changed, and numbers are now numbers have been around for years, and now with the whole digital, it's just going to be more and more of that. And most of our traditional kind of risk skill sets are simply becoming irrelevant. So realizing that there's a big gap in own knowledge is a huge thing. So that to me is kind of step number 0. But while we are thinking about the kind of step 1, 2, 3, Geraldine and Paul asked a question. So let me just read those questions to you, and you can quickly respond to that. I can add to that as well. Geraldine is asking, outside of financial services, where should the CRO report? Can you give like a 1 minute quick answer to that, and then I'll add to that as well.
Well, as I said, they tend to gravitate to the finance function, mainly because CEOs and others think of risk as being more financially related than any other concept, although there's a good argument for why it's, at least in North America, more underpinned by legal questions. That's that kind of insurance claim mindset. And it's relevant for that aspect of the job. But, as I alluded to earlier, I really think the best people that make the best senior risk leaders are those that understand the depth and breadth of the business best. And whether they were in operations or they are in operations, they need to have that operational perspective, at the same time being very strategic in their way of thinking. So even though not many people report there, I like to think that there's a good reason for them to report to the head of operations, or for other reasons, but equally important, be part of the group, if there is one, that is accountable for strategic planning and measuring the success or failure of the organization. I've only run across a few senior risk people who actually had that responsibility in addition to being head of risk, which I thought was both, interesting and somewhat surprising, because that to me meant that there were some people that were actually getting it. So if I were to, again, choose where they report to, it would be operations or planning as my preferences.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Interesting you say that. I totally agree. I think a while back I've written an article, where should the risk management function sit, and I think my two messages in both the video and the article were, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. You want it to be somewhere high enough that there's at least some status. Otherwise, you can't really walk into CFO's room and talk to him, or head of production, or head of marketing, or head of strategy. You need to at least be able to kind of have a normal conversation and not go through some other, go through the secretary and everybody else. So you need to be on par, like somewhere close to the top. But then at the end of the day, what is much more important, to integrate into actual decision making, to integrate into business processes, you need to have access to the information flows. And the closer you are to the owner of the business process, the better. And that's why I totally agree with what you said, Chris. Sitting with operations, or head of strategy, or head of planning, or somewhere not far from budgeting, it actually makes our life a lot easier, because it's much easier to integrate within one department than it is to come to a head of strategy from a different department and say, allow me to influence your business process and allow me to work with you on this, which many people perceive as entrenchment on their territory. So the closer you are to the data, the better. The higher you are, the better. But the bottom line is it doesn't really matter that much. In some countries, they've made it a legal requirement to report to the CEO. Lucky for us, for example, in Russia, there's a legal requirement that risk reports to the CEO. So, thanks for that. Other than that, doesn't matter. And while you were answering the question to Geraldine, you actually answered the question that Paul asked as well. Well done.
So just a side comment, because I mean, the easy answer is that they ought to report to the CEO, and that's an amazing thing that's what's happened in Russia. Probably if you ask most rating agencies or regulators in the U.S., they'd say, yeah, that's our preference too. But most CEOs don't agree, not in North America, and so it's really the exception where they do. But if you can accomplish that, what you get out of that, right? You get all kinds of gravitas and credibility underpinning what you're doing, just as by nature of the reporting relationship. But the downside, of course, is that a lot of CEOs won't give you the time of day that you need, when you run into the challenges that you do. So it's a good news, bad news.
Exactly. So exactly. So the fund where I used to work, the organization where I used to work, we actually made the decision to move away from direct reporting from CEO exactly for that reason, because you could only catch a CEO who is traveling a lot, maybe once a month if you're lucky, and that's just not enough to do your job. So we made the decision to give up on this amazingly looking on paper thing of reporting directly to the CEO and report to COO, who's actually much more hands-on, on the ground, and able to help integrate into all kinds of decisions and business processes. So that's why I'm saying it actually doesn't matter that much.
But one other comment, even though all of what we've said is reality, what you do need is a mandate, I think. And that mandate needs to come from the CEO and or the board. And that mandate, its only value is when it's reinforced. And that reinforcement is what helps you maintain your influencing capability and credibility with those that you need to play along in order to accomplish what you're after.
I totally agree with that. And that actually sounds like a good point to add to our to-do list. Step number 0, realize your own gaps. Step number 1, get a mandate from the CEO. What else can a senior risk leader do to make sure he's prepared for the future of normal risk management, where risk is not seen as a quarterly exercise done for compliance purposes, or not seen as a purely insurance activity, where risk is actually a tool that is integrated into different types of decisions, different types of business processes to help companies make better strategies, better budgets, better investments, better procure, and so on, better forecasts and production. What are some of the other steps that risk leaders can take?
Well, I think, that's a lot of different things, of course, and understanding those different elements and components of how organizations work, is at the heart of success. You can't be an expert in all those areas, but just as an example, do you understand the way success and failure is actually measured? And how do you align the way you measure and report on risk with the way the organization measures and reports on its performance and its success? So fundamentally understanding how the organization does that and then aligning your processes that relate to it effectively is really fundamentally important.
I take it one step further, and you've raised a number of very important messages, and one of them goes on the list. But I'll take it one step further. It's not just obviously you're 100% on the money. You have to understand how performance is measured. Even before that, you have to understand how performance targets are set, because the reality is most performance targets are set without proper consideration of risk. That basically means that many of those targets are unachievable a year in advance, and everybody knows they're unachievable because nobody's actually taking the active steps to consider risks and take them into account. So the numbers are unrealistic, and that creates all sort of stress and fraud opportunities for management.
Right.
But that is important. But then coming back to your point that you need to align risk processes with the performance management, I think we need to take it one step further. Is risk needs to be integrated into performance management. And instead of having a risk report, which I personally feel is absolutely useless, we should adjust performance reporting. We should adjust how KPIs are calculated. We should adjust how KPI performance, factual performance against KPIs is measured, is calculated and measured and represented, to make sure our risk information, basically our volatility, our variance, our key risks, that they're not sitting in a separate risk report, they're sitting inside the existing performance report of the organization. This is, for example, what I have done at least 5 years ago. I have dropped, I never had a risk report per se. The CFO had his quarterly performance report that he presented to the board, and the graphs and the numbers and the words in his report were changed to make sure all the risks were taken into consideration and accounted for.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And not to just kind of echo what you're saying, but I mean, to me, nirvana in that world is having what we call in the North American world a corporate scorecard or an organizational scorecard, which is the way organizations define and then communicate how they're doing, having it represent the risk component of those questions. And whether that's just, I mean, on the simplest level, it's matching KRIs to key risk indicators to key performance indicators, KPIs being typically those things that populate those scorecards. And most often don't include the KRI or the risk element. So in that alignment to me is kind of golden.
And can I, just reiterate on that point, because I feel this is very important, even though I'm kind of dwelling on the same thing. I feel KRIs should not exist at all, because if you integrate risk into performance management, your KPIs stop being a single number, become ranges that are volatile depending on the risk, associated with that performance metric. And then your KPIs are KPIs, and whatever else you want to call it. It's all in one. You don't need a separate KRI. Like, there's absolutely no reason to have a separate KRI. That is actually a classic example of risk managers trying to patch up the bad work done by the performance management instead of fundamentally changing the root cause or kind of solving the problem. Because creating an additional KRI is a very short-term fix, as opposed to just changing how all KPIs are calculated and not having to do any additional KRIs on top of that. I mean, I'm not sure that message is clear enough, and sorry, but I have like a whole video on risk-adjusted performance management.
I apologize, Alex. I have to plug my computer in here before it fails on me. I forgot the battery was low. There we go.
Peter asked a question about risk management models. Peter, can you please clarify what you mean by risk management models? Because that's not really the terminology that is commonly used in the world. I mean, a financial model refers to an Excel file which has cash flows, assumptions, and reports. Risk management model could mean absolutely anything. So please clarify what you mean. So let me summarize some of the things we said, because I'm still trying to pull together this list of items. And one of the important messages that you've mentioned, Chris, is that the senior risk leader cannot be an expert in everything, because risk management truly is a huge umbrella. I mean, it has health and safety, it has investment, it has budgeting, it has strategic decisions, it has procurement. That's way too much for a single person. What is some of the advice? Some of the advice there.
Forgive me, Alex. I've been wrestling with my power cord here. So
Sorry.
before my machine died, I had to make sure I got that fixed. Would you repeat the question?
I was picking up on one of the things you said, and is that a senior leader really is highly unlikely to be an expert in all of the fields that come under the umbrella of risk management. I mean, it could be ranging from health and safety to legal risks, to strategic decisions, to budget decisions, to investment decisions, to projects and schedules, to production forecasts. What advice would you give to senior risk leaders in that situation?
Well, that's really the underlying argument for why stakeholders are so important, because you're right, we can't be experts in everything. And if you do charge the risk leader with being someone who understands what's going on across the broad spectrum of the way organizations operate and what they focus on, then there's no way they can do that. So, to me, the backup plan or the core response to that is developing the relationships in the right places across the organization for those, what I call key risk stakeholders, to play their role in the process. Maybe that's a risk committee, that they contribute through, maybe not, depending on how your organization operates. But it's at least knowing who to go to and have the relationship to engage those people in risk-related aspects of your plan, your strategy, when you need to, and to be able to get them to play a game that is, frankly, often under-resourced from the standpoint of, what risk leaders have as their own direct resources to call upon. So often you'll find a risk leader in even big organizations being a one-person show. You would say, wow, that seems odd, and if risk is important, why wouldn't they be better resourced? Mm-hmm. Well, all kinds of answers to that question, but I think it doesn't matter. You deal with the card or the hand you're dealt. And, if that's a resource restricted environment, it's all the more reason why you need a robust stakeholder community with the relationships between you that, help them succeed, so that, you get that mutual benefit of them helping you succeed as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What else? What else would you say is an important action for the senior risk leader to take for the future? And I'll just recap. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Well, as you know, I've kind of harped lately and thinking a lot about what's happening to the risk profile. And I know you have a different view of it, but I really believe that what I call the digitization of organizations, and then as a result, the risk profile itself, is going to require risk managers, risk leaders, to have a much better skill set related to understanding how technology is impacting the way things are done and the way things will be done differently in the future. And I think the average of us, myself included, don't have those skills to be able to respond effectively to how that will affect your risk strategy and then everything else in the company that represents, the mission of the organization and the strategic plan that says how you'll accomplish that. So the old model was, just rely on your relationship with the CTO or the CIO to get that. That ain't going to work anymore. So I think the challenge for risk leaders of the future is really up in their game with respect to understanding the impact of technology on their organizations and what they do.
Mm-hmm. And does that lead to you to another advice that goes on our list? Is maybe in some situations you have to build a business case for an additional resource in the risk team and hire someone who specializes in quant or in data analytics or in some other modern day technology that is relevant to the future of the organization.
Agree. Just as well as maybe having a technology expert on your staff. I mean, I think they're both pretty critical. It doesn't relieve you of the responsibility of, climbing that learning curve yourself. But like everything else, I mean, senior leaders are more about influencing and directing and leading as opposed to necessarily executing. And they need the right resources to execute. So those two subject matter experts, I think, are critical for the risk management staff of the future.
And this is, I think, where kind of the whole glass house is beginning to shatter, because many senior risk leaders are feeling threatened by hiring a new young individual who is an expert in a particular field, because, well, some of them believe that this will expose their lack of understanding on the subject. And I think that's where some of the trouble may lie is, you know, I get it. You know, 40, 50-year-old risk managers have transitioned from insurance, have know nothing about cognitive biases or probability theory or decision theory, and they're probably not going to learn. I mean, we are responsible for most of risk management education in Russia and the Russian-speaking countries. And I don't have any illusions about it. I know that when we teach 30, 40-year-old risk managers for 5 days to learn probability theory, I know they're not going to learn and become experts in probability theory. It's impossible. It's like a 3-year degree to get to know that. So how do we overcome that challenge of people not really willing to learn and do it themselves, but also feeling somehow threatened by hiring someone else?
Well, I mean, I know that's an issue, but frankly, the bigger issue to me is how do you attract that kind of talent into your world of risk management when their leaning is into a technology world, or their leaning is into, some more interesting application of quantification and probability theory and the other things that go along with that. I think that's the harder part. But, to me, if you're threatened by having the right expertise on your staff because you don't understand it as well as they do, then you shouldn't be a leader. That's my simple answer. Leaders don't worry about them having resources and staff that are smarter than them. That's the goal. You should have people that know more than you do. And then if you're a real leader, you're able to, bring that together, translate it into something useful and actionable.
Yep, I totally agree. Since we're trying to come up with practical ideas for the senior risk leaders to take away home with them, one option may be introducing some sort of rotation program where you have an agreement with an IT department or a legal department that one of their staff joins for like 3 months the risk team and helps out with stuff and learns, important risk skills as well, and then it goes through different rotations. Maybe that's an option. But I do totally agree with you. I mean, I actually don't see a scenario where a good technical young individual would want to join a risk team because he has so many better opportunities.
Yeah, exactly what I mean. So, yeah, I think the rotation idea is actually a good one. I've always believed that rotation for other reasons actually made a lot of sense. If you know anything about the old General Electric model, it was my understanding that they used to run everybody with high potential through the audit department so that they would get a good view of what the business is all about and how they actually, make the widgets and make the money. And so lots of high profile, high performance, ultimately senior level and even CEO level people in that organization came, through the audit department, at least in part, for that purpose. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. I always felt that, good risk people should be given that same kind of rotational opportunity for the same reasons, whether or not they ever aspired to be, CEO or whatever, it didn't matter. It was really getting the skill set developed that would help them understand what's going on and then be able to be more effective in what they're, told they need to be doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Carol is asking an interesting question before we move on to the next point. Carol is asking an interesting question. It's difficult to move forward with the changes to risk reporting, kind of the traditional risk management, because Big Four auditors, audit companies, and it's funny that she mentions Deloitte and KPMG. that because they still stick to old guns, they promote traditional. I mean, I usually say that national risk institutes are equally at fault because they do promote traditional risk management a lot. RIMS is probably RIMS and RIMS in US and RMIA in Australia are probably the better ones. They at least trying to move into the space of proper decision making. So bottom line is there are a lot of organizations and institutes that are stuck in the traditional view of risk management where you have to do a quarterly risk workshop, generate a risk report, and you've done your job. That's a challenge. I'll quickly tell you how we've overcome that challenge. And the reason why I said Deloitte and KPMG are funny is because our institute has trained everyone in the risk team at Deloitte and KPMG. I think everyone at KPMG for sure, and like 80 or 70% of the Deloitte's risk team, to make sure they bring proper messages to the market. And for the last 2 years, we've actually been running like a risk maturity survey with Deloitte to make sure they ask the right questions, they offer the right services. They'll of course still sell, whatever the client is asking for to make money. But if somebody asks them, what's a better risk report, the chances are they'll probably say the best is not to have a risk report. The best is to integrate into existing performance reporting. So we've, in some countries where you have a proactive kind of leadership that changes the agenda of the whole risk profession, we've been lucky enough to start changing that. But other than that, what do you think? How do you, as the risk leader inside the company, how do you overcome all this external pressure to continue doing the bare minimum?
You mean to get beyond doing the bare minimum?
Well, yeah. How do you deal with the fact that S&P comes in and they want to see a risk management framework document, or Deloitte does an external audit and they ask for a risk appetite statement, which of course is absolutely stupid, but they do.
Well, it's a challenge, isn't it? Because those guys, the auditors the external auditors have the ear of the very top. And a lot of times, they just agree and say, okay, do it, because the external auditor says that we have to have it. But I think that's the opportunity for a true leader to step forward and go, but have you thought about why? I mean, what's the value proposition? If there's no real sustainable or supportable value proposition, why would you do it? Just because an auditor says it's a nice thing to do? Come on, that's no basis for directing resources. Now, if you get into a regulator insisting on it, you got a little more challenge there. But I found that when I was designing the risk program at one company, and Standard & Poor's in particular was emerging to say, you know what, we're going to rate your program. We're going to tell you whether we think it's good, bad, or otherwise. We came out of that pretty well with the highest rating each of the 5 years we were rated. But the benefit of it was that even though we were scared to death of where it was going, thinking it might affect our credit ratings if we didn't achieve what they wanted, was we had the unique opportunity to influence their view of what they wanted. And so even if somebody like a rating agency or a regulator or even an auditor, frankly has a preconceived, baked-in view of what is good or bad in managing risk, I think leaders with that influencing skill developed the way it should be able to push for an alternate view of that, to be able to say why, to be able to say, have you considered this as something that has more value rather than that, whatever it is. Creating a risk appetite statement is your example. Or maybe they would say, you need a risk register, right? Which you hate even more, right, Alex?
Yes.
Or whatever it is. It's easy to just kind of pull the box off the shelf and say, these are the 12 things that make up a risk management program. That's the worst thing you can do, right? The absolute worst thing you can do. So I think, again, it's about leadership. It's about influencing. And people might say, well, I haven't been successful at that. I say, you need to work on it. You need to develop those skills because they're actually the most important aspect of any kind of role that has impact, right? You can have all the quant skills, all the technical skills you want, but if you can't lead and influence, you might as well consider another lot of work.
I totally agree. That's very well said. And if that fails, because that's by all means, this is the right thing to do. But for some reason, if that fails and you're not ready to resign and you want to stick around for a little longer, because I mean, resign is not the bad thing. I mean, I resigned from my last job. I resigned because I did not. I took a proposition to the CEO. He didn't want to kind of go that direction. I said, fine.
I did it 6 times myself.
Yeah, it's not the worst thing. Like it's not as scary as it sounds.
Right.
But if you're not ready for that, that's where the whole concept of risk management 1 and risk management 2 comes in. I've created the whole idea that whatever the regulator and the external auditors and the internal auditors and the board of directors ask for, that's for risk management 1. And the challenge there is to come up with the quickest, simplest, least effort way of doing it. So they want a risk appetite statement, do it within like 5 minutes. Don't discuss it, don't do like the workshops, don't do the whole shebang around it. Just they want it, get it done. They want a risk management framework, download something off the internet, tailor it to your business, done. And have this whole facade, window dressing, I call it, for risk management 1. And then risk management 2 is what you focus on. This is where your proper integration into decision making comes in. And that's where you spend 90% of your time. So some of us, especially in regulated industries, we have to continue play this game. We have to pretend like we think risk registers are useful. And the way we do it is just we keep this risk register specifically for S&P. Nobody in business uses it for anything because they use other stuff for proper decision making. But, that's also an option, not an ideal option by any means.
Well, I understand where you're coming from, Alex, but I have to push back and say there's a lot of danger in given something that's been requested by a board or even a regulator or a rating agency, short shrift. And I know you don't literally mean 5 minutes, but yeah. If you don't produce something of quality, I would say don't produce it.
Yeah.
Because I mean, if you put a piece of crap on the table, you're going to get whacked for it by anybody that has half a brain. I mean, to put it bluntly, that's where that would go. So the
assumption is that the risk manager would never put something that is crap on the table. And the second assumption is that, and this is, I've actually tested it so many times, it's not funny. No one cares what's in your risk register. Like no one in the organization cares. No one cares what's in your risk appetite statement. No one cares what's in your risk management framework document. No one cares what's in your risk register or your risk report for that matter. So that it's easy. Not ideal by any means. So let's not dwell on that too much. I wanted to very quickly respond to.
Well, I think your 90-10 ratio may be suspect. I know it's your preference, but your 90-10 ratio between RM2 and RM1 might need some refinement.
Possibly. I've tried to live by that rule, to be honest. Like I literally try to keep my RM1 to 10%.
It's a good goal.
Yeah, that is. I think you put it right. That's the goal. Like that's the way you want to get to. Along the way, the challenge is that at the moment, I can almost guarantee that majority of the organizations have it the other way around. 90% on RM1 on stuff that no one cares about, and maybe 10% on something meaningful for the business. And that is so much worse. That is just so much worse.
But that goes back to the question of, value proposition and doing things that have value to somebody, right? Why would you spend much time on things that don't, as you point out, people don't really care about? They may be asking for it, but they don't really care about it. And that's where, again, it takes people with, mature leading and influencing skills to understand the difference between some perfunctory request for something because it's a nice to have and somebody that really wants it because they're going to use it for some some meaningful purpose, in particular making a good or better decision.
And you've touched on such an important point, because a friend of mine always calls me and he says, like, oh, the CFO is requesting this way of reporting risk, and he's asking me how to do that, and I'm saying, no, he doesn't. He's requesting the thing, but he doesn't really need it. He's not going to use it for anything. It's not going to change the way he makes decisions. It's not going to lead to anything. So the real answer to his request is he's just trying to make you do stuff to appear that some sort of activity is happening. It's not a real request. So you shouldn't be coming up with a real solution to that. The problem is somewhere deeper than the phrase that he used, like the request that he used. And it's very important to be able to prioritize between something that is valuable and something that is perceived to be necessary for the business.
Right.
I think those are very different things.
Hey, listen, I know we're getting near the end, so we got to fill out your list, right? Because you wanted to put 10 things on the table, right?
Yes, I have 6. Give me
you have
more.
6?
Yes.
So I got all kinds of things that, I've said. I have a list in front of me actually that I use in a lot of presentations on this topic that I call what really matters to senior management. Mm-hmm. I've mentioned a couple of them, but one of the ones, just picking from the list to fill out our top 10, is something I think you'll like, which is the combination of reliable measurability and what I call data interpretability. Those are all big words, I know, but measures don't matter unless they're reliable. Data doesn't matter unless you can actually use it for something effectively to make a decision. And so those two things, I think, are maybe combined into one, something that we need to think about when it comes to how we use information.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make your list?
Yep. This is a very important question that a risk manager, every senior risk manager, should ask themselves: is what they produce reliable? And all heat maps and all risk registers fail that test immediately because they're all subject to cognitive biases. And unless you've taken specific steps to overcome cognitive biases or debias your experts, then it's not reliable. So that goes out of the door. You have to produce meaningful risk information. You have to actually take, like, this is a pretty scientific process. You have to take additional steps to make it more honest, correctly measured, and accurate. So reliable, and what was the other word that you used?
I use interpretable.
And that was a better one that you've said, kind of in the explanation of that. I think I remember something that it has to be reliable, but it also has to be meaningful for something. Like, it has to be used for something. It's not just producing
the other term I love is actionability.
Yes.
Yeah. All of those things are tied together as kind of a single concept. Another one for the list might be the combination of what I call process rigor and consistency. We all have processes we're responsible for. I would say, at least in most organizations, making sure they're tight, making sure they operate well, making sure they're consistent in their purpose, I think is a focus of a lot of management about how you do your work and what you're focused on. So I know that's a little vague, but it's two attributes of processes that you're responsible for executing and maybe even designing that you need to think about before you really begin executing.
Okay. What else?
Well, I have a list of things not to do. I'm interested in that.
Yeah. Don't do heat maps, don't do risk registers, don't do risk management frameworks, don't do risk appetites, don't do mitigations, don't do risk owners.
Uh-oh. I think we're up to 15 or 20 now. I don't know. So you want to argue about risk culture versus culture, or I know that's a soft thing, but I personally believe it's pretty important because, whether or not you really believe risk culture is separate from culture itself, the risk aspect of culture, or the aspect that defines how risk-taking behaviors emerge or
Yep.
not, has everything to do with whether an organization is set up for success to take the appropriate amount of risk in order to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
A mouthful, but that's my personal philosophy. So,
Yep.
that to me means, and the phrase I use when I talk about this topic is having an embedded risk culture. That is the one you want. Because my other adage is, if you haven't taken the time to define it, you probably have the wrong one.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I don't particularly care about the differentiation, whether it's risk culture or its cultural aspect of corporate culture. It doesn't it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. And I also feel that it's super important because, again, that's the beauty of risk management. Most of the things that we have to talk about is not opinion based. It has been scientifically proven for at least 50 years. So when we talk about culture, we start thinking about, well, what's risk perception and risk attitude, and not in the kind of in the risk appetite sense that consultants came up with, but risk perception. Google it. There's a whole page on Wikipedia which has a lot of scientific research around it, which basically suggests that people tend to be ignorant of risk, not risk averse or risk aggressive. They tend to be ignorant. They don't see risks unless specific steps are taken to switch on system two thinking. This is where all Daniel Kahneman's research comes in, the one that he got Nobel Prize for in economics in 2002. But this is like a whole field of very fascinating study. And what it basically says is that unless risk leaders take active steps to develop this risk culture, nothing's going to happen. It's not just going to
Mm-hmm.
magically appear. And it's not about hiring the right person. I mean, you can hire anyone. And in December, when their bonus payment is calculated, they will do whatever is necessary to get the bonus payment, even though that they're a great parent, great person, and good in every other conceivable way. Every December, they will start making bad decisions, bad risky decisions, because they want the bonus payment just like everybody else.
Yeah.
And again, there's a very scientific reason for that. It's not a
Yeah.
surprise that people behave like that.
Yeah. So maybe that's a great segue to a final point, with a minute or two left. And that is to not leave people in suspense about this graphic we've had on the screen for the last hour, right?
Yeah.
So let me just explain it real quick. I've been referring to this for a long time because I think it's pretty valuable. It's admittedly a little bit dated research, but this is based on a survey of more than 1,000 CFOs in North America, particularly. And it basically says that the perception of the traditional risk manager is somebody who's very short-term, tactically focused, that doesn't have much appetite for risk. And I think those traits, to the extent they're still accurate, and they are to some degree, are exactly the wrong traits to have as somebody who wants to succeed as a high-level risk leader. And so what it says in the middle there, you see that middle person with the arrow pointing to them, that's somebody who's got this broader, higher-level role, of, whether it's CRO or VP of risk or whatever it is, but the broader perspective, who at least is climbing the curve of longer-term mindset and being more willing to take risk. But there's still a far cry from the CEO and the strategist and the others who sit up in that far right-hand quadrant, who are much more strategically long-term focused and who are much more apt to take risk in order to achieve objectives. So if we want to make it up there with them and be the influential leaders that I argue we all should ultimately aspire to, we need to recognize how we're perceived, which is why I titled this slide The Way We Were, because I think it is more about the way we were than the way we are. Your comment, Alex?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And let me just quickly, in the final minutes, unless we have more questions, I mean, do send your questions through if you have any. Peter asked about a model that works. Peter, there are a number of great books. The one I recommend is by Douglas Hubbard called Why Risk Management is Broken, and another one by Carl Spitzer called Decision Quality. So that gives you like a pretty specific model on what risk management should look like if it's to be a good risk management. Paul wasn't really asking a question. I think he was just making a comment, which, yes, thank you. We agree. I will be, if you're watching from US, I will be in US in March, late March, and I'll be at the conference, which has a very, very fascinating lineup of speakers. So do join. I've just provided a link for that. I've given you some links to the articles, and don't forget the Risk Academy channel on YouTube, which has answers to hundreds, I think it's like 250 or something videos on different topics. And that's the channel where this video will be available in a short while as well. So any more questions?
Alex, do you mind if I plug as well? So I'll be speaking at a forum in Chicago in mid-April called The Future of Risk Management. It's going to be developed by the institutes. So if you want more information on that, you can go to theinstitutes.org and find out more about what's going on there.
Keep talking. I'm finding that link.
Okay. I'm also speaking on the future of risk at the WCI conference in August in Orlando, Florida. We're going to be talking about a lot of the different concepts that are going to affect the future of risk management, some of which we've spoken to today. I know that's more of a narrowly defined conference, but the fact that they want me to bring a panel to that conference to talk about the future of risk management is a good sign of how even more narrowly focused subject matter experts are beginning to think about the broader context. I would also recommend you consider, even though this sounds like an oxymoron, there's an organization in California that I contribute to called insurancethoughtleadership.com, who also runs the Innovator's Edge. And they're not just about insurance, but they are about global thought leadership. And that's a platform where you can get a lot of information about a lot of topics that we've been talking about and a lot of others as well.
Yep. I just found the link to the institutes and I sent it.
Awesome. By the way, thanks for posting my Cedric Institute link as well, Alex. I'm listening to the people that I'm interviewing every month, and you'll get a perspective on what people are doing and thinking about. I tend to talk to only people that are really successful in my eyes and in all kinds of different ways, so you can really learn from them.
Paul, and I've provided you the link to the list of books. The one that I recommended first in is Hubbard and Spitzer. Any other questions? No? Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Alex. Good to see you all. Thanks for attending. We really appreciate it. All the best to everybody.
Bye.
So long.